morning, church family. It's good to be here. It's always good to be here. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Maddox. Fantastic. I will say it's kind of tough to follow a sermon that Dan May preaches. We had a great weekend last weekend. It was awesome. A lot of gratitude to Dan and Robin for coming down and for everyone who was involved, whether you volunteered, whether you just attended, even if that was just on Sunday. It was really, really great, and something that we're hoping to build on going forward. Dan actually kind of kept us in our series about being engaged and being a series on choices. And for Dan, it was a series of choices on your relationship with your spouse and with your children and how that is to glorify God. 2 weeks ago, I brought up the biggest enemy, in my estimation, to a rich and abundant life in Christ Jesus. It's a problem that many of us have. That's the problem of hurry. And we went over a little self-diagnostic tool. I highly recommend, if you haven't had a chance to hear that, go over that. It's convicting. Things that you think, I'm not hurried, I'm cool, I'm laid back, and then you start going out a list and you go, oh, maybe I do hurry a little here and there. And I started to present that problem of a hurried life. Well, today we're going to talk about an interesting thing to be engaged in to help with the problem of hurry. And it sounds straightforward when I say this, when I say that we need to be engaged in silence and solitude. Now, what some of you might have just heard me say just now was we need to be engaged in being bored. And at some level, yes. That's kind of the first started if you haven't been doing it. You know, oh, where's my clicker? Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jay. I'm old enough to remember being bored. My kids, not so much, not as often, but this was when Sawyer wasn't happy with his coloring page, and so Tamara started doing it, and he had to watch. He was very bored. But most young kids today, and I would say even adults now, aren't that bored. There's not a lot of opportunities, a lot of chances for boredom. I mean, if I was to say boredom is your cell phone without data, without Wi-Fi or internet, but also without any pre-downloaded games, music, or books, how many of you have a phone that matches that description? Dan, you win. There's a prize for you later. It's kind of hard. You'd also have to have no music, no TV, no activities to attend. Bored is actually something you have to achieve. Outside of this time here right now, for some of you having to listen to me preach, you probably aren't bored very often. Don't nod your head. But there was a time when you'd be on a road trip or flying somewhere where you'd finish your book early and you'd close it and then you'd stare out the window. Why? Because you had nothing else to do. Or you'd be waiting in line, 5 people in front of you while you're trying to get coffee, the horror, I know, and you just stand there. Extroverts start striking up a conversation, and the introverts are going, why me? Why this person? Anybody remember that? Waiting for a bus? Sitting in a class with nothing else to do but let your mind wander? What happened to daydreaming? When's the last time someone said, hey, are you daydreaming? Or you said that to someone, or even heard the word daydream? And while it's kind of easy to sentimentalize something as simple as boredom, none of us probably really want to go back to a pre-digital world. We're more efficient than ever. We get more done than ever. Way more than I could have ever dreamed. But again, there's pros and cons. We now have access to an infinity of information and stuff through our phones and the internet, which is great, but we've also lost something crucial. All those little moments of boredom were potential portals into prayer. They were moments throughout our day when we could wake up to the reality of God all around us, to wake up our own souls, to draw our mind's attention and with it devotion back to God, to come off the hurry drug and become aware of God's voice. Now it seems all those moments are gone. They're swallowed up by our access to information and entertainment and games and even just communicating with others. There's a million different ways to swallow up your boredom nowadays. And the second we feel a moment of boredom, what do? Just going to pull this out. respond to this email. I'm going to doom scroll on Instagram, look up the weather, start shopping for shoes. You can do anything. You can play words with friends, with your friends, and cheat while being on the internet. Not that any of you have ever done that. Kirk, you looked up really quick when I said that. A survey from Microsoft over a decade ago found that 77% of young adults answered yes when asked, when nothing is occupying my attention, I reach for my phone. That was a long time ago. I bet that number's gone up. But it gets even crazier. A 2017 Gallup poll asked parents, hey, is it good for kids to be bored now and then? Only 1 in 5 said yes. 80% of parents say, no, my kids should never be bored. We have parents raising kids to not know what peace and quiet and boredom and stillness is at all. You think those parents themselves are ever bored anymore? I'd say pretty much the only place where you can get some peace and quiet now is the shower. But it won't be long before they put a touch screen in there and you're watching YouTube and answering emails, and that'll probably trigger the apocalypse. But I allow myself this brief rant just to say that all of this has profound implications for our apprenticeship to Jesus, our discipling under Jesus, our modeling our life after him, and our experience of the life that he alone has to offer. How so? How are we missing out? It's simple. That normal of hurry, digital distraction is kind of robbing us of our ability to just be present. Present with God, present with other people, present to all the good and beautiful and true things in our world, even present to our own souls. I heard a quote recently. It says, there are books to be read, landscapes to be walked, friends to be with, a life to be led, but with the epidemic of distraction in our civilization's specific weakness is that distraction. And it's a threat not so much to our minds, even though they suffer under that pressure. No, the real threat is to our souls. And at this rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget we have a soul. The noise of the modern world makes us deaf to God, drowning out the input of whose voice we need to hear the most. How do we have any kind of spiritual life when we can't pay attention? How are you supposed to pray, read scripture, get through one of my sermons at church, rest well on the Sabbath? Even just take a night off when every second we're reaching for the little dopamine dispenser. Over and over and over, just hooked on our phones. We're distracting ourselves into a spiritual oblivion. Okay, rant over. I know I talked about these dangers of being hurried a few weeks ago, but I felt like I needed to show you a symptom of constantly being hurried. Now I want to pose a question to you all. Is there a practice from the way of Jesus' life that could help with this? Like a time-tested art form, if you will, or a spiritual discipline, you'll hear me say that the next few weeks, a spiritual discipline, that could set us up to thrive right in the middle of the chaos? Yes, the answer is yes, obviously. The next few weeks, we're going to look at 4 of them, roughly. But I wanted to start with what I consider the hardest one, especially for me, and that's the idea of silence and solitude. Jesus found the quiet place. Starting in Matthew, we'll be in the Gospels today. At the end of chapter 3, you have this scene, this story of Jesus' baptism. Incredible moment. In verse 16, it starts off by saying, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was open, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. This is the launch pad from which Jesus is sent out into the world. And the very next line in chapter 4, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. What? After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him. What's the first thing Jesus does after his baptism is head straight into the wilderness. Now, wilderness doesn't necessarily mean like a hot and sandy desert, this dry and barren wasteland. The Greek word there is eremos, and it has a wide variety of meanings. It can be translated desert, deserted place, solitary place, lonely place, quiet place, wilderness. And there are stories, lots of them, in all 4 Gospels about Jesus' relation to the eremos, to the quiet place, to the lonely place. But this is the first story you see, and I want you to see it because it's the starting place for his ministry. But it's kind of odd. Well, why did he lead him into the wilderness to be tempted? Why not with his friends to support him? This is weird. And then he's fasting and he's super hungry. I mean, it almost, when you're trying to wrap your mind around why this happened, you kind of go, okay, well, I guess Jesus has got to go toe-to-toe with the devil, right? The protagonist has got to face the bad guy to end all bad guys. Evil must be defeated. But why in the wilderness alone and when he's hungry? I used to thought of the wilderness as a place of weakness. I read it like this: isn't that so like the devil? To show up when Jesus is tired and hangry and lonely. Classic devil. But then I had it backwards. That's not it at all. The wilderness isn't a place of weakness. It's a place of strength. Jesus was led by the Spirit to the wilderness because it was there and only there that Jesus was at the height of his spiritual powers. It was only after a month and a half, essentially, of fasting and time with the Father that he had the capacity to take on the devil and come away completely unscathed. The solitude, the silent place. Take Mark 1. Mark 1 is essentially one really long chapter about Jesus' first day on the job as the Messiah, right? You get into verse 21. Verse 21 talks about he goes to the synagogue. All right, step 1. Step 2, teach. And not just teach with authority. When I help Sawyer with a math problem, I'm teaching him. That does not take much energy. Teaching the junior high kids, preaching, takes energy. It's work. But for good measure, he casts out a demon too. Then it's lunchtime. Well, he goes to Simon's house. And at Simon's house, of course, his mother-in-law needs healing. And this is one of the more funny things. After he heals her, she feeds them. She tends to them. I find that super funny. But if that's not enough, then people start knocking on his door. And he starts healing them. And then he starts casting out demons. And he makes them stay silent, trying to get kids to be quiet. And if demons are anything like that, I don't know. That seems like work too. All of this seems like a full day, more than I've ever gotten done in a day, it seems like. I don't even know I could check off half of them. So what does he do the next day? Does he sleep in? Does he take it easy? Mark 1:35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, Eremos, where he prayed. He must have been exhausted. And you would think, all right, Jesus is going to take it easy today. Maybe he's one of those people, and you know who you are, you got to get up and still go to the gym every morning. You got to do your thing. Cool. But then after that, you want to have brunch with the bros, right? And just, a nice farmer's scramble or Denny's Grand Slam to help reignite you and restore you. No. Not Jesus. To clarify, Jesus went to the quiet place for a month and a half, went toe-to-toe with the devil, came back to Capernaum for a day, went to work, and then did what? Went back to the quiet place again. Meaning the quiet place isn't just this one-time thing, it's an ongoing part of his life's rhythm. A life rhythm that we're all trying to model. But listen, the story's not over there. Verse 36 and 37, Simon and his companions went to look for him. And when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Here's my version of that if that happens today, right? Jesus, where have you been? Everyone's talking about you. You knocked it out of the park yesterday. It was a killer day. It was so awesome. Hashtag Peter's house is trending. Okay? Let's get back at it. Let's get back in there and keep feeding the machine. And what does Jesus say? Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. Essentially, Jesus is like, no, hard pass. No, thank you. Remember what Jesus was doing and where he was before they just found him? Jesus came out of the wilderness, the quiet place, with all sorts of clarity about his identity and calling. He was grounded and centered. He was in touch with God and himself. From a place of emotional balance and spiritual power, he knew what to say yes to, and more importantly, he knew what to say no to. Man, that's hard. That's something I struggle with, what to say no to. As the Gospels go on, you quickly realize that the quiet place was a top priority for Jesus. There's a story in Mark 6, verse 31, where we see the disciples, they've been dead tired because they've been out in the kingdom, doing the work. And then we read this, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. Anybody been there? Every parent in the room is like, yes. He said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place, the Eremos, and get some rest. Translation there, what you need is not a beer or a night out with your friends no. What you really need is time alone with me. But to do that, we got to get away from all the noise and all the people. So we read in verse 32, so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, to a quiet place. Time alone with Jesus at a seaside location, the stillness and the waves crashing, little aromatherapy, some organic hot tea maybe. That sounds awesome. Unfortunately, that's not how the story goes. Check this out. This is wild. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time, it was late in the day. I love the realism of the stories. There's times when what we really need is time alone with Jesus. But, well, life happens. People happen. You set aside time to Sabbath, to rest, to pray, to just take a night off. And you get a text. There's a crisis at work. A kid comes in and tells you they ate their Legos or they're stuck in their ear or up their nose. Legos are a big problem. There's a lot of things. Your teenager is washing the dishes and then the sink won't drain because the garbage disposal is broken. Not his fault. It just happened. Just is what it is. There's lots of things that get in the way. Maybe there's thousands of people banging on your door asking you to heal them and teach them about the kingdom of God. Ordinary life stuff, right? You ever feel like try as you might, you just can't get time to rest? I feel like you just can't get that time to rest? Yeah, Jesus dealt with that too. And that's not the end of the story. A boy's backpack and 5,000 meals, a minimum 5,000 meals later, and we read this. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Before I get to this next point, I just want to stop for a second. There were thousands of people there. I'm sure normally the apostles all helped in dispersing the rest of the clouds. Let's go, guys. Okay. And Jesus recognized his guys, his disciples, needed Eremos and said, no, you go. You guys get in the boat. I'll handle this by himself, apparently. How can you not love Jesus? But then it says, after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. I used to read that and think, wow, Jesus he's so spiritual. He does all this stuff, and then he does more, and he goes up and prays. Well, that's what was strengthening him. That's where he got his power from, because it's the only time in this case that he could find the alone, quiet time. Because he was so busy, he literally didn't have a moment alone, so all he could think to do was send his apprentices away for their own sakes, dismiss the crowd so he could stay up all night on a mountain. And the word Eremos isn't used here, but a mountainside at night, that'll fit the bill. A quiet place, a lonely place. And he did this because he knew that time alone with the Father was even more important than sleep itself. We haven't even gotten to Luke's gospel yet. In Luke's gospel, there are no less than 9 times that talks about Jesus in the quiet place. Just one more story about that and I'll stop, I promise. Luke 5, verses 15 and 16 says this, yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Crowds are banging down the front door. Think about that. If someone showed up at your house with a work emergency or something else, how many of you go, oh, sure, come on in? Oh, you have a need? You just come on. Or how many of you, this is kind of an invasion of our privacy. Boundaries. The lonely places. You guys know what that word is in Greek? You should by now. It's eremos. He made it a point to sneak off to lonely places and pray. It was a common habit in his daily routine. In Luke's gospel in particular, you can actually chart Jesus' life on 2 axis points. The busier and more in demand he became, the more famous he became, the more he prayed. His chart looks like this. The more popular, the more busy he became, the more he prayed. How many of our charts look like this? The busier we become, the less we pray. The less we go and do that things. When we get busy, when life is hectic and people are vying for our time, the quiet place is almost always the first place to go instead of the first place we go to. Speaking from experience here. To just sit and be still with God in the quiet, to pray, to read a psalm, to take an inventory, to just kind of let our souls catch up to our body. We need more time in the quiet place, not less. Definitely not less. And if you're running through your list of excuses in your head right now of why maybe you can't do this or why you don't do this. I'm a parent. I have kids. I work a lot, David. I wake up early. I just have a demanding job and life schedule. There's a lot of people that are depending on me. I'm an extrovert, David. I just need to be around people. I have ADHD, and so my kids are in every activity because they can't be bored. There's 80% of parents basically said that. It can even be as simple as, David, I can't stand the quiet. I just don't want the quiet. We have to stop and think for a minute. Jesus needed the quiet place. I'm going to repeat that. Jesus needed the quiet place. Who are we trying to be like? Whose life are we trying to model? Well, Jesus made a point to get time in the quiet place, and quite a bit of it. And we think, I don't need that. That's not for me. He lived in a different time. He couldn't understand how busy I am. David, I have tens of people, I have hundreds of people that need me. And Jesus is like, yeah, do they show up at your front door knocking? There are like thousands of them. He gets it. Maybe he could understand. Through the years, this practice of Jesus has come to commonly be called silence and solitude. As simple as that sounds, there's a lot to it. So a word on each. First is silence. There's 2 dimensions of silence. There's external and internal. External silence is pretty self-explanatory. No external noise, no outer noise, right? And it's an intentional setting that you're creating and you're getting yourself to, right? No music on in the background in the headphones. No TV on, even in the background. No kids yelling, playing Minecraft or whatever. No, none of this stuff. No chatting with friends or family while you're trying to empty the dishes. Just silence. It's when you're up earlier than everyone else or you're up later than everyone else and they're all asleep. It's when you're out in nature on a hike. It's when you're driving with windows up, nothing on. It's quiet. It's when your ears kind of hum. It's so quiet. You start to pick up things. I don't even hear. What is that noise? It's the fire alarm beeping probably because I need to change the batteries. When your ears are humming and you have that silence, that becomes a spiritual discipline in and of itself. It's hard. A long time ago, St. Augustine, said, entering silence is entering into joy. How many of you people think that right now? Boy, if I could only just get it silent, then I could really have my joy. Personally, for me, these past few weeks have been busy. This is the busiest January that I can remember. Seems like everything's picking up speed. And I even thought, boy, Dan's coming to preach. I get a weekend off. Awesome. Yeah, that was not the case. That was not the case at all. I was busier than ever. We had a season of things going on that we planned, just plus things that just happened. And the power goes out, that just throws your life into chaos. And then when it came back on, the fridge didn't really work anymore. The freezer doesn't work. And while we're looking to replace the fridge, then the garbage disposal doesn't work. And then when I'm at Lowe's and I'm looking at the thing, I'm like, cool, it costs this. And I'm like, well, why does installation cost twice as much? Let's pull up YouTube. How hard could this be? Ego, ego, ego. And I'm like, oh, simple DIY. I could figure this out. And what's my one question to the guy as I'm paying at Lowe's? Hey, if I mess this up, can I come back to get the installation? Yeah, of course. So the next day when the plumber was at my house, he said, you were really close. You almost got it. All the things. And I knew I was preaching on silence and solitude today. Do you know what happened to me last Friday? I got a killer migraine. I don't get them too often. But even the medication that I've been prescribed doesn't actually do, it kind of stops the highs from being so high, it brings it to a baseline of here, but the pain still is like here, so I'm just cruising in this. I go to sleep in pain, I wake up in pain. It's rough. Maybe you believe this, maybe you don't, but for me it was God's painful call to say, I'm going to show you the Eremos. Because honestly, the best medicine for my migraines is a quiet, lonely place. I've been giving you guys lots of quotes, but they're just so good. The friend of silence draws near to God. It's so much easier to hear God when it's quiet. Nobody ever says that about the noise. Boy, all the noise going on all through my life, I just hear what God's telling me. In fact, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book called The Screw Tape Letters, and what he calls the devil's realm, he calls it the kingdom of noise. Man, is that not telling? Why do we let so much noise run throughout our lives? Where does that urge come from when I get in the car to turn on NPR or Spotify or Jack FM or Pandora, whatever it is, immediately, boom, crank it up. Why do I gotta fall asleep with the TV on at night? I gotta listen to my podcast. I can't even work out without listening to a podcast or something. As easy as it is to blame the devil, could it be that we're using our external noise to drown out our internal noise? And here's what I mean by the internal noise. That's that mental chatter that never stops. That running commentary in our heads. And to silence that is an intentional focus. Not just a setting, it's a focus. To turn off that conversation that didn't go well with a loved one earlier in the week. To turn off our frustrations when someone says something to us. How dare they say that to me when I care about? How rude. Oh, how disrespectful. Or stress over paying the bills, over our kids and everything in their lives just going perfectly right. Listen, our internal noise can go on the positive too. It doesn't have to just be negative. It could be the future. Oh, idealizing this perfect life, these busy things, these great plans, just thoughts. The clutter in our mind makes us become like these mental hoarders where we can only be in our room and we just have little pathways because there's so much junk and noise in our minds. We've built up ourselves trapped in these patterns in our own minds. That external noise, that's easy to quiet down. Just turn off your phone, turn off the stereo, lie on the couch, go to the park, go for a drive with everything off. Much easier, but internal noise, that is a whole different animal, and it is a wild beast in need of taming. And there's no kind of off switch for that, unfortunately. But Jesus modeled this silence when we can turn off both the outside and the inside noise. And then we go to a place of solitude. And that's pretty straightforward. That's when you're alone with God and your own soul. And for clarification, I don't mean isolation. Those are two very different things, right? Solitude is an engagement. Isolation is escapism. Solitude is safety. Isolation is danger. Solitude is how you open yourself up to God. Isolation is how you put a target on your back for the tempter. Solitude is when you set time aside to feed and water and nourish your soul. Isolation is when you crave that neglect that you've just created. by not doing that. And so solitude, as somber as it sounds, is anything but loneliness. Loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. In solitude, we are anything but alone. In fact, that's where many of us feel connected to God. And as I've said earlier, and we've talked about this, one of the great problems of spirituality in our day and age is that so few people feel safe enough to say, I don't feel a connection to God. I'm not going to admit that to anybody. We rarely experience God's presence throughout the day when we're struggling, when we have all this noise, but we don't admit it. Love, joy, peace. Does that describe the average Christian and their experience? How many people go to church to just get a quick fix, a fleeting moment of connection to God, and then return back into the secular wasteland from which we came from? Could the antidote for this spiritual issue be as easy as silence and solitude? Well, the theory right here, that we're looking at Jesus and how he did it. On some level, yeah, it's certainly a start. The problem is more our absence than his. It's more about our distraction than his disconnection. The solution is fairly simple. Come back next week and we'll talk about it. It's your hook. I'm getting better at these hooks. This, again, was one of those sermons where I just had way too much to say about it because I struggle with it. I just leave it at this verse, be still and know that I am God. Man, that's hard. We're going to continue this discussion, and I think it's vitally important that as we get engaged here at Canyon, as we get engaged at becoming better disciples and better making disciples, as we ourselves then need to imitate Christ. It's great that we want to bring people to church and to our life groups and into Bible studies, but we need to model what Jesus modeled for us, because we're going to have a hard time reaching anyone with any real connection if we're not doing that. There used to be a saying in the restaurant world, never eat at a restaurant that the chef himself doesn't eat at. Never eat at a restaurant that the chef himself doesn't eat at. Why? He doesn't have a passion for the food. He's not into it. It's a super telling sign that he's not bought into the food or the experience. Guess what? People want to go to a church where people are passionate about being Jesus Christ. Why wouldn't they? That's just the reality. I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. That's just the reality. And Jesus got a lot of his power through finding the eremos, making the quiet time in the lonely place. We have to start finding our own eremos. If you haven't accepted Jesus today as someone that you want to model your life after, to be baptized, to surrender your life to him, hey, there's never any better day today. We have a hot tub. You don't have to do it in a cold pool. You can do it in a hot tub. That's nice. And the other thing is, if anyone's struggling with that inner monologue, that inner voice, just beating them down, they're struggling, don't struggle alone. Jesus knew when to help his disciples take a break. Let us love on you. Let us listen to you and hear you. We would love nothing more. If anyone has any needs, please let it be known. Come as we stand and sing.